For years, the Honda CR-V and Toyota RAV4 have been treated almost like the automatic answers for anyone shopping for a compact SUV. But that reputation does not mean every version is mechanically simple. The CR-V has increasingly relied on turbocharged engines, while some RAV4 owners have reported transmission-related concerns before reaching roughly 60,000 miles. Even so, walk into almost any dealership looking for a practical SUV and these two names will probably be among the first ones mentioned. That is exactly why the alternatives are worth paying attention to. Sitting in a similar price range are three SUVs that take a much more traditional approach to what happens under the hood. Instead of depending on a small turbocharged engine or a continuously variable transmission, they use naturally aspirated engines paired with conventional automatic gearboxes that shift through actual fixed gears. That setup may not sound as advanced on a specification sheet, but technology is not always the same thing as long-term durability. If you are planning to keep a vehicle for far more than 2 or 3 years, mechanical simplicity starts to matter a lot more. Fewer highly stressed components can mean fewer expensive surprises once the odometer begins climbing. After watching automotive engineering evolve for more than 2 decades, these are exactly the kinds of powertrains I would put near the top of my shopping list, and here is what makes this list even more interesting. A huge number of buyers barely notice these SUVs at all. If your goal is to own something capable of traveling well beyond 200,000 miles, there is one important point you need to understand first. On many modern vehicles, the biggest ownership expenses are not always caused by the engine itself or by the basic structure of the car. Very often, the expensive part is everything responsible for transferring that engine power to the wheels. A continuously variable transmission is a good example. Unlike a traditional automatic gearbox, it does not simply move through a normal sequence of fixed gears. Depending on the design, it relies on a continuously changing ratio system built around components such as pulleys and a flexible drive element. The result can be very smooth acceleration and good efficiency, but when a major repair becomes necessary, the cost can rise quickly. Older conventional automatic transmissions could often be opened, serviced, rebuilt, and returned to the road by an experienced transmission specialist. Some modern continuously variable units are much less straightforward to repair. When the problem is serious enough, replacing a major portion of the transmission assembly can cost several $1,000s. That is where the three SUVs in this ranking separate themselves from much of today's market. Each one follows a more familiar mechanical formula: a naturally aspirated 4-cylinder engine connected to a traditional torque converter automatic transmission with fixed gears. In practical terms, that means there is no turbocharger adding another expensive component to monitor, no conventional belt-driven continuously variable transmission in the drivetrain, and fewer complicated systems that could become costly as the mileage starts moving deep into 6 figures. Pay especially close attention to the SUV in the number 1 position, because its ownership numbers are surprisingly strong. According to RepairPal data, its average annual repair and maintenance costs come in at only a few $100s, and it also earns one of the stronger reliability ratings in its class. What makes those numbers more meaningful is that they are not based on a handful of online comments or isolated owner stories. RepairPal builds its estimates using a large amount of real repair and service information, which gives us a much broader picture of what ownership can actually look like over time. So keep watching through the ranking, because one of these three SUVs may completely change the way you shop for a used vehicle. Instead of automatically choosing the most famous name or the model packed with the most technology, you may start focusing on what becomes far more important after years of ownership and hundreds of thousands of miles. Now, let us get into the three SUVs that deserve far more attention than they currently receive. If you enjoy content about cars, technology, innovation, and smarter choices for buying better, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. We are very close to reaching 1,000 subscribers, and every new subscriber helps this project keep growing. Here, you will find videos made to show what is truly worth it in the automotive world, with no fluff, no hidden advertising, and always focused on useful information for anyone who wants to avoid bad buying decisions. So, if this content helped you in any way, subscribe now, turn on the notification bell, and follow the next videos. Your subscription may seem simple, but it makes a huge difference for the channel. Thank you for being part of this journey toward 1,000 subscribers. Coming in at number 3 is an SUV that may still make some buyers hesitate the moment they see the badge on the grille, the Hyundai Tucson. And that reaction is understandable. 10 years ago, I probably would have been cautious too. But the 4th-generation Tucson, introduced for the 2022 model year, is a very different vehicle from the older Hyundais that helped create some of the doubts people still associate with the brand today. The reason this newer Tucson deserves a closer look becomes clear once you examine the powertrain. In the standard gasoline version, Hyundai uses a naturally aspirated 2.5-liter SmartStream 4-cylinder producing roughly 187 horsepower. That engine is connected to a conventional 8-speed automatic transmission with a traditional torque converter, and that combination is exactly why this SUV made the list. You are not dealing with the dual-clutch transmission found in certain turbocharged versions, and you are not getting a continuously variable transmission either. This particular Tucson uses a proper fixed-gear automatic with a torque converter, a layout mechanics have been working on for decades and one that can become especially attractive if your plan is to keep the vehicle for a long time. That matters more than many buyers realize when shopping for a used SUV. A torque converter helps smooth the transfer of power between the engine and transmission, especially when pulling away from a stop or crawling through heavy traffic. A dual-clutch gearbox can certainly deliver quicker shifts and a more responsive driving feel, but it also depends on additional clutch components that can see more wear during repeated low-speed city driving, and when major work is eventually needed on one of those more complex systems, the repair bill can climb into the thousands of dollars. The Tucson's 8-speed automatic follows a much more familiar formula. That does not mean you can ignore maintenance. Fluid condition still matters, scheduled service still matters, and neglect can shorten the life of any transmission. But when mileage starts climbing into serious territory, a simpler and more conventional design can become a meaningful advantage. The ownership cost numbers also help make the case. RepairPal gives the Tucson a reliability score of 4 out of 5 and places it favorably among compact SUVs. Average annual repair expenses sit in the range of only a few $100s, which is still lower than what many comparable vehicles can cost to keep on the road. Stretch that difference across 10 years of ownership and even a relatively small annual saving can add up to several $1,000s that stay in your bank account instead of disappearing into repair shops. But there is one area where you have to be extremely specific with Hyundai. Not every generation deserves to be judged the same way. Some older Hyundai engines developed well-documented mechanical concerns. Certain members of the Theta 2 engine family, especially in earlier generations, were associated with internal engine issues that led to costly repairs and multiple service campaigns. Depending on the model and market, several Hyundai and Kia vehicles built roughly between 2011 and 2019 were affected. That is exactly why model year and generation matter so much. The Tucson sold from the 2022 model year onward with the naturally aspirated 2.5-liter SmartStream engine uses a different architecture. So if someone tells you that a 2016 or 2017 Tucson is mechanically almost the same as the newer version, do not accept that comparison without looking deeper. The platform changed. The engine changed. The transmission strategy evolved. And most importantly, you cannot automatically transfer the reliability reputation of one generation onto another. If I were shopping for one of these newer Tucsons on the used market, there are 3 things I would absolutely verify before spending any money. First, confirm exactly which engine is under the hood. The version we are discussing is the naturally aspirated 2.5-liter gasoline engine, not the 1.6-liter turbocharged hybrid setup, which uses a completely different drivetrain. Second, get as much maintenance documentation as possible. Service records can tell you more about a used vehicle than a shiny exterior ever will. Look for any unusual engine or transmission work and make sure routine oil changes and scheduled maintenance were handled consistently. Third, run the vehicle identification number through the appropriate recall database and confirm that every required campaign or service action has already been completed. So, who is this Tucson actually best suited for? It makes the most sense for someone who wants a comfortable, quiet, easygoing SUV for everyday use. There is nothing complicated about the way it drives, the cabin feels modern, and Hyundai has traditionally offered warranty coverage that stands out in this part of the market. On the American used car market, examples from the newer generation can often be found below the mid-$20,000 range, depending heavily on trim level, mileage, condition, location, and model year. Now, if you are the kind of buyer who trusts Toyota or Honda almost automatically and the Hyundai badge still makes you uncomfortable, there is no reason to force yourself into a purchase you do not feel good about. Brand confidence matters when you are spending tens of thousands of dollars on a vehicle, and that caution becomes even more reasonable when you start looking at much older Tucsons, because mechanically they are simply not the same vehicle. That is what makes this third-place pick so interesting. A lot of buyers are still judging the current Tucson based on problems connected to Hyundai products built on completely different platforms with completely different engines, but isolate the 4th-generation model and the picture changes considerably. This Tucson combines a very modern overall vehicle with some surprisingly old-school mechanical choices. And if long-term ownership matters more to you than chasing the newest drivetrain trend, those choices deserve serious attention. My conclusion on the Tucson is straightforward. If you are willing to look beyond the badge and carefully choose the correct engine and transmission combination, this can be a much smarter used purchase than its reputation suggests. It can often cost less than some of the biggest names in the segment while remaining relatively reasonable to maintain over the years, and if the Tucson is already starting to make sense, the SUV in the number 2 position takes this idea even further. The next vehicle shares a meaningful amount of engineering DNA with Hyundai and follows a similarly traditional mechanical philosophy. But it brings one particular advantage that could matter enormously if you are planning to keep your next SUV for a very long time. This is the kind of information you could easily spend real money getting from a detailed inspection, a specialist consultation, or hours of research. Here, we break down these ownership details regularly at nocost.so if you want to know which used vehicles are genuinely worth your money, which ones are designed to handle high mileage, and which models may help you avoid unnecessary expenses over the years. Subscribe to the channel, because there are still some much more unexpected vehicles coming up on this list. Taking the number 2 spot is the Kia Sportage, and its biggest selling point is not a larger screen, another driver assistance feature, or some flashy special edition. What stands out most is something far more important for long-term ownership: the level of confidence Kia has traditionally shown in the mechanical components of this SUV. In markets such as the United States, Kia has offered the original owner powertrain coverage lasting as long as 10 years or roughly 100,000 miles. That is an unusually long period, and it sends a pretty clear message. A manufacturer does not normally attach that kind of coverage to an engine and transmission combination it expects to become problematic after only a few years. That said, there is an important detail every buyer needs to understand. Warranty terms are not identical in every country, and they can change depending on where the vehicle was originally sold, when it was first registered, and whether ownership has changed. So before assuming anything is still covered, always check the paperwork and the exact terms attached to the specific vehicle you are considering. The Sportage becomes even more interesting when we focus on the generation introduced for the 2023 model year. Underneath, it shares a significant amount of engineering with the Hyundai Tucson we just discussed. Depending on the market, both SUVs can be equipped with the same naturally aspirated 2.5-liter SmartStream 4-cylinder engine. That engine produces about 187 horsepower and roughly 178 pound-feet of torque, and it is paired with a conventional 8-speed automatic transmission, and that drivetrain is exactly the kind of setup this entire ranking is built around. There is no continuously variable transmission in this configuration. There is no complicated dual-clutch gearbox. And there is no turbocharger adding another highly stressed component under the hood. No, this Sportage is not built to turn every stoplight into a performance contest. But that completely misses the point. Its strength is somewhere else. The engine is designed to start every morning, move the vehicle without drama, and keep doing the same job year after year with as little unnecessary complexity as possible. If you are buying a used SUV with the intention of keeping it for a long time, that can be far more valuable than shaving a few seconds off an acceleration run. But there is one mistake you absolutely cannot make with the Sportage: treating every generation as if it used the same mechanical formula. It does not. Some older versions used engines from the Theta 2 family, particularly across several models built roughly between 2011 and 2016. Certain engines from that era were connected with major technical campaigns and expensive internal mechanical issues on some vehicles. So if I were looking at a Sportage from those years, I would never accept a seller simply saying that the vehicle has always run fine. I would want the service records. I would want to know exactly how consistently the vehicle was maintained, and I would verify, in writing, which manufacturer campaigns were completed and whether any major components had already been repaired or replaced. Move into the generation that arrived for the 2023 model year, however, and the mechanical story changes considerably. The platform is newer, the engine design is different, and many of the underlying systems were reworked. The 2.5-liter SmartStream is not simply an older engine with a few updates bolted onto it. It belongs to a different architecture with revised lubrication, fuel delivery, and overall engine management, and one part of that fuel system deserves special attention. Depending on the exact specification, this engine can use a combination of port injection and direct injection. That means fuel can also be introduced upstream of the intake valves during certain operating conditions instead of relying exclusively on direct injection. Why should you care about that? Because some engines that rely only on direct injection can gradually develop deposits around parts of the intake system. Using port injection as well can help reduce that tendency under certain conditions, making it an interesting design choice when you are thinking about ownership over many years rather than just the first few. Still, it is important not to overstate what we know. This generation is simply too new to have the same long-term history as a vehicle that has been on the road for 15 or 20 years. Nobody can responsibly promise exactly how every example will behave after 200,000 miles or more, but from a mechanical design perspective, there are several encouraging choices here. Removing the turbocharger means eliminating a component that operates under high heat and heavy load. Using a traditional automatic transmission also avoids the unique operating characteristics and repair considerations associated with continuously variable transmissions, and when you are trying to keep a vehicle for a very long time, every complicated system you can remove from the equation is one less potential expense waiting somewhere down the road. RepairPal also gives the Sportage a reliability rating of 4 out of 5, while average annual repair costs remain in the range of a few $100s. For a modern compact SUV, that places it in a relatively reasonable ownership cost bracket, and this is where one of the simplest rules in the entire automotive world becomes surprisingly important. A component that is not installed on the vehicle can never require replacement. If there is no turbocharger, there can never be a turbocharger replacement bill. That sounds almost too obvious to mention, but buyers often forget this logic when comparing vehicles on a showroom floor. The more complicated systems you add, the more potential areas there are that may eventually need attention as the vehicle ages. There is another trap to avoid if you are shopping for a used Sportage, and this one involves the warranty. Never assume that every benefit available to the original buyer automatically transfers to the next owner. Coverage can vary depending on the country, the vehicle's original market, its ownership history, and how it is sold. The safest approach is to take the vehicle identification number and confirm the remaining coverage directly using the official documentation for that particular vehicle. Choosing the correct engine matters just as much, depending on the country. The Sportage can be offered with turbocharged gasoline engines, hybrids, plug-in hybrids, and other powertrain combinations. Those versions may use completely different transmissions and supporting hardware. So if the reason you are interested in this SUV is the simple drivetrain we are discussing here, make sure the exact vehicle you are buying really does have the naturally aspirated 2.5-liter engine paired with the conventional 8-speed automatic in the market where it was originally sold. Who does this version of the Sportage make the most sense for? Someone who wants a newer SUV with modern styling, a well-equipped cabin, and plenty of everyday technology, but does not necessarily want the most complicated powertrain available. Inside, it can easily feel more expensive than its used market price suggests. Underneath, however, this specific configuration sticks with a surprisingly traditional mechanical formula. On the other hand, if you regularly tow heavy loads or your main priority is strong acceleration and higher performance, another powertrain may suit your needs better, and once again, none of this should be automatically applied to older Sportage generations. Go back several model cycles and you are dealing with different engines, different transmissions, and a completely different technical foundation. So for this ranking, the conclusion is clear. A newer Sportage equipped with a naturally aspirated 2.5-liter engine and a conventional automatic transmission deserves serious consideration from buyers who value mechanical simplicity. It gives you a modern-looking SUV, a traditional fixed-gear automatic, no turbocharger in this specific version, and the backing of a brand that has made long warranty coverage one of its strongest selling points for years, yet plenty of buyers still overlook it completely when they begin shopping. But the SUV in the number 1 position pushes this entire idea even further, because the next vehicle is the one that really changed the way I think about recommending an SUV to someone with one main priority: keeping it on the road for years without turning every visit to the repair shop into an expensive surprise. Before we reveal number 1, put your prediction in the comments. If you have been paying attention to the clues throughout this list, you may already know which SUV is about to take the top spot. Now it is time to see who guessed correctly. Taking the number 1 position is the Mazda CX-5. And it did not earn the top spot because of personal preference or brand loyalty. The numbers are what pushed it ahead. RepairPal gives the CX-5 a reliability rating of 4.5 out of 5, placing it among the strongest vehicles in its class and ahead of several highly respected SUVs from Toyota, Honda, and Subaru. But reliability alone is not what makes this Mazda such a compelling used purchase. Its repair and maintenance expenses have also remained relatively manageable. When you combine a straightforward powertrain, reasonable ownership costs, and a strong record of durability, you end up with the kind of used SUV that becomes very difficult to overlook, and the most important part of that formula is sitting right under the hood. Mazda took a different path with its naturally aspirated 2.5-liter Skyactiv G engine. While much of the industry moved toward smaller displacement engines and added turbochargers to recover performance, Mazda spent its engineering effort making a traditional naturally aspirated engine more efficient. One of the ways Mazda achieved that was through an unusually high compression ratio, approaching 13:1 in certain versions. For perspective, many conventional gasoline engines operate closer to 10 or 11 to 1. Higher compression can extract more useful energy from combustion, but there is a trade-off. Increasing pressure and temperature inside the cylinders makes controlling combustion considerably more challenging. So Mazda engineered several solutions around that problem, including a carefully designed exhaust system and extremely precise combustion management. The payoff is simple: strong efficiency without automatically needing a turbocharger, and for long-term ownership, that is exactly what gets my attention. Every component you remove from the equation is one less component that can eventually require attention. There is no turbocharger constantly operating under intense heat, no complicated boost system adding additional hardware, and power is delivered progressively through a relatively straightforward naturally aspirated engine. Mazda made another smart decision deeper inside the engine. Instead of relying on a timing belt that normally requires replacement at a predetermined interval, the Skyactiv G uses a timing chain. Depending on the vehicle and labor rates, replacing a timing belt can easily become a four-figure maintenance job. With the CX-5, you generally do not have that same scheduled timing belt expense hanging over the ownership experience, and when you start looking at the repairs commonly associated with this Mazda, an interesting pattern appears. Many of the things owners eventually spend money on are normal wear components or peripheral systems rather than major internal engine or transmission work. Air conditioning problems, for example, can occasionally become one of the more expensive items. If a compressor needs replacement, the repair can approach $1,000 and, depending on parts and labor, potentially move beyond $2,000. That is certainly not pocket change, but think about what that also tells you. When an air conditioning compressor is one of the more notable expensive repairs people discuss, that says something encouraging about the major mechanical components underneath the vehicle. A properly maintained Skyactiv G engine has developed a reassuring reputation over the years. The conventional automatic transmission also does not have a reputation for constantly creating major problems on examples that have received proper maintenance. For many CX-5 owners, the maintenance story is almost boring: oil changes, brake service, tires, filters, routine inspections. And when you are buying a used vehicle, boring can be one of the best things you could possibly hear. There are CX-5s running well beyond 150,000 miles without producing any dramatic mechanical story worth telling. And that may be one of the greatest compliments you can give a dependable vehicle. Nothing particularly exciting happens, you maintain it, drive it, and it keeps going. RepairPal's numbers point in the same direction, with average annual repair costs sitting at only a little over $400. That puts the CX-5 in territory normally associated with several Japanese vehicles that have built their reputations around durability, but annual averages always need context. Those figures represent thousands of vehicles, different owners, different climates, different maintenance habits, and completely different driving conditions. An average repair cost does not mean every CX-5 will be inexpensive every single year. That is why I never judge a used vehicle by one reliability score or one annual cost figure. I also look at the hardware itself and ask a much more important question: what is actually there that can become expensive as the vehicle gets older? And that is where this Mazda starts making an extremely convincing argument. The naturally aspirated 2.5-liter engine eliminates several components found on more complicated powertrains. There is less supporting hardware than you would find around a turbocharged setup, no additional heat generated by forced induction, and an engine architecture that has now spent years proving itself on the road. When properly maintained, these CX-5s can also accumulate serious mileage. Crossing 125,000 miles should not automatically scare you away from a well-maintained example, and reaching roughly 185,000 miles is entirely possible when the vehicle has received consistent care. If I were shopping for a used CX-5 today, however, I would narrow my search. The second generation is where I would spend most of my time. Models produced roughly between 2017 and 2021 with the naturally aspirated 2.5-liter gasoline engine offer an especially attractive balance. They feel significantly more modern than the earliest CX-5s while still retaining the relatively straightforward mechanical philosophy that makes this vehicle so appealing in the first place. I would simply become more cautious as I move toward the earlier production years. Some older examples generated more discussion around electronic issues and certain drivetrain-related concerns. That does not mean every early CX-5 should automatically be rejected, but if two vehicles had similar mileage, condition, and price, I would generally lean toward the newer one. On something like a 2018 or 2019 model, I would verify that every applicable manufacturer campaign and service action had been completed, and just like every used SUV on this list, I would want the most complete maintenance history I could possibly get. I would test the air conditioning. thoroughly, listen carefully for unusual suspension or wheel-related noises, and pay close attention to the automatic transmission during the test drive. Shifts should feel predictable and consistent without unusual behavior, and that transmission deserves some attention because it is another major reason the CX-5 fits this ranking so well. Mazda pairs the engine with its 6-speed Skyactiv drive automatic. At its core, this is a conventional torque converter transmission, but Mazda designed the control strategy to lock the converter frequently whenever driving conditions allow. Why does that matter? Because excessive converter slip creates heat, and excessive heat is one of the biggest enemies of automatic transmission longevity. By reducing unnecessary slip, Mazda can improve efficiency while also limiting some of the heat generated inside the transmission. Put everything together and you begin to understand why the CX-5 landed at number 1. A naturally aspirated engine. A timing chain. A conventional 6-speed torque converter automatic. There is nothing revolutionary about that combination, and that is exactly the point. When you are trying to keep a vehicle for 10, 15, or even more years, you do not necessarily need the most revolutionary drivetrain on the market. You need engineering that is well understood, reasonably predictable, and proven enough that maintaining it does not become a constant guessing game. So who should seriously consider this Mazda? The person who wants an SUV that almost disappears into everyday life. You get in, you start it, you drive, you maintain it properly, and then you repeat that process for years. But unlike some vehicles that achieve simplicity by sacrificing comfort and refinement, the CX-5 still manages to feel surprisingly upscale inside. Material quality is generally impressive for the segment, the cabin feels well assembled, the seats are comfortable, and road noise is reasonably controlled. Even when you buy one used, it does not necessarily feel like you chose the budget option. Mazda also approaches driving dynamics differently from many mainstream SUV manufacturers. The steering tends to feel more precise than what you find in several competitors, and the chassis gives the driver more feedback without making the ride unnecessarily harsh. So the CX-5 manages to be a rational ownership choice without becoming dull to drive. Of course, there are compromises. If maximum cargo capacity sits at the top of your priority list, competitors such as the Toyota RAV4 or Hyundai Tucson may offer more usable space depending on configuration, and if infotainment technology is extremely important to you, some of the earlier second-generation CX-5s are beginning to show their age. The systems still work, but the interface can feel noticeably older than the rest of the vehicle. Neither drawback changes the reason this Mazda sits at the top of the ranking. Mazda managed to create a modern and reasonably efficient powertrain without making a turbocharger mandatory, and when long-term ownership is one of your biggest priorities, that engineering decision becomes much more valuable than it might appear on a specification sheet. If I had to choose just one of these three SUVs and keep it in the family for as many years as possible, the CX-5 would probably be the one I would put at the top of my shopping list, not because it beats every competitor in every measurable category. It does not. What makes it work is the complete package. A relatively straightforward engine, a conventional automatic transmission, manageable ownership costs, solid build quality, and driving characteristics that are more engaging than you might expect from a practical compact SUV. Now I want to know what you would choose between the Hyundai Tucson, Kia Sportage, and Mazda CX-5. Which one would you actually buy with your own money? Tell me in the comments, and if you already own one of these three SUVs, share your current mileage and what your ownership experience has been like so far. Statistics and technical specifications can tell us a lot, but real owners are the ones who show us what these vehicles are actually like after years of everyday driving. You have now seen three SUVs that share one very important advantage: they avoid two types of technology that can become expensive as the years and mileage add up. We are talking about certain continuously variable transmissions and heavily stressed turbocharged engines. No conventional CVT system built around constantly changing ratios, no turbocharger living under extreme heat, and fewer components that could turn an aging SUV into a much more expensive vehicle once the odometer moves well beyond 100,000 miles. Instead, all three follow a much more traditional formula: a naturally aspirated engine paired with a real automatic transmission that uses fixed gears. On paper, that may not look as impressive as the newest technology being advertised today. But if you are buying a used SUV with the intention of keeping it for many years, this kind of simplicity can matter far more than an extra feature on a specification sheet. After watching this video, you already know how to identify several mechanical details that many buyers never even think to check before signing the paperwork at a dealership. And those details can have a huge impact on how easy or expensive that vehicle becomes to own later. So the next time someone automatically recommends a Honda CR-V or Toyota RAV4 simply because those names have strong reputations, do not stop at the badge on the tailgate. Find out exactly which engine is installed, check which transmission the vehicle actually uses. See whether there is a turbocharger under the hood, and most importantly, confirm whether you are dealing with a continuously variable transmission or a conventional automatic gearbox. A few questions before the purchase can save you from a lot of unnecessary expenses after the purchase. In this video, I showed you 3 SUVs that stand out because of the way their powertrains are designed. But if your budget is tighter, there is another part of the used car market that may deserve even more attention. I have also put together a list of 3 much more affordable used SUVs that most buyers completely ignore. Yet when you choose the right versions and maintain them properly, they can be surprisingly durable, and that is exactly what makes them so interesting for anyone trying to stretch a limited budget. They may not wear the most desirable badge, they may not be the first models people search for, and they may not have the same popularity as the usual favorites, but on the used market, being overlooked can actually work in your favor, because when fewer buyers are chasing a vehicle, prices can stay much more reasonable even when the mechanical package is genuinely worth considering. That video is right here. In it, I break down 3 affordable SUVs that almost everyone passes over, but that can make a lot of sense if your goal is simple: get as much vehicle as possible without spending more than you need to. My perspective comes from more than 2 decades of watching how vehicles age, how they are maintained, and which kinds of repairs tend to appear over time. But as always, the best choice depends on your own driving habits, budget, and priorities. Before you go, tell me in the comments which one of these 3 you would choose with your own money: the Hyundai Tucson, the Kia Sportage, or the Mazda CX-5, and if you already own one of them, share your current mileage and tell us how it has treated you so far. Your experience could help someone else avoid the wrong purchase or discover a vehicle they had never seriously considered. I will see you in the next video.